Okay. Our session today is concerned with descriptions for the features of isolated or separated parts of the thoracic cage. And as you know, the thoracic cage is made of ribs, sternum, and vertebra. And I will start with the ribs. Generally, the ribs are classified into typical and atypical ribs. And I will present to you first features of a typical rib. This is one of the typical ribs. How could I know that this is a typical rib? I can say that this is a typical rib, or that is a typical rib, because it has the following features. First, it has an anterior end that is rather concave to articulate with the costal cartilage. Second, the typical rib has a posterior end, and this posterior end is made of three parts: the head, the neck, and the tubercle. The tubercle, neck, and head are three parts of the posterior end, and we can see that the head contains two facets, upper and lower facets, for articulations with the vertebra, and in between them is a crest, as you can see. So because this rib has a posterior end made of a head with two facets, neck, and a tubercle, and also the rib has an anterior end that is concave, serving for attachment of the costal cartilage. This is the typical rib. And in between the anterior end and the posterior end, this is the shaft of the rib, which is typical rib. We can see that this is the tubercle of the posterior end. If you go 5 centimeters from the tubercle, lateral to the tubercle, this is the tubercle, and you will go 5 centimeters lateral to the tubercle, you can see that the shaft shows an angle. This is the angle of the shaft of the typical rib. Also, you can see that the upper border of the shaft of the typical rib is rather rounded, while the lower border of the typical rib is rather sharp, because the inside of the lower border of the shaft of the typical rib shows a groove, which is called costal groove, containing the Van bundle, the neurovascular bundle, which are intercostal nerves and vessels. So because of these features, this is a typical rib. And after the session, please try to examine this rib as a typical rib, and also this rib, which is a typical rib, and also this rib, which is a typical rib, and that rib, which is shorter than the others, but it is also a typical rib, that because it carries the same features, and that's also a rib marked by attachment of muscle, and I don't want you to know what are the muscles, but it is a typical rib. Mostly students ask me, how could the question will be on the exam, in the practical exam. One of your colleagues asked me, how could I know the answer to the practical question? Practical question, there will be a pointer or a pin on the tubercle of the rib, for example, on the neck of the rib, on the head of the rib, on the facets for articulation, on the angle of the rib, on the costal groove, on the anterior end. These are part of the questions that could be answered. Also, I may put this whole rib and ask you, is this a typical or atypical rib? This is another type of question. And I may ask you, why this is a typical rib, and so on. Anything or any of the ribs that does not have such a features is atypical rib. For example, this rib is the first rib. You can see that there are many variations in the shape and description of this rib. It has an anterior end which is pointed and for attachment of the costal cartilage. It has a posterior end that is made of a head, neck, and a tubercle. So the first rib, it is atypical, and as part of that, it has an anterior end which is concave just like the typical, and has a posterior end which is formed of a head, neck, and a tubercle just like the typical. But the first rib, first of all, is short. Second, the first rib contains a tubercle here on the middle of the inner border of the shaft, which is called scalene tubercle, that serves for attachment of scalenus anterior muscle. And this scalene tubercle separates two grooves behind it and in front of it for the subclavian artery and vein. And all of these could be questions in the exam. I may ask you, what is this? You may say, this is the head of the rib, of the first rib. This is the neck of the first rib. This is the tubercle of the first rib. And this is the scalene tubercle of the first rib. These are the grooves of subclavian vessels on the first rib. This is the anterior end of the first rib. Well, I will ask you, what rib is that? You may say, this is the first rib. Is it typical or not? You may say, yes, it is atypical. I may ask you why it is atypical. You should say that because it contains tubercle for scalenus anterior. It is short. It contains groove for subclavian vessels and so on. You may see also that rib. And obviously it is also a first rib containing the tuberosity or tubercle for scalenus anterior with the grooves of subclavian vessels. This rib is rather deceiving because it is not short just like this rib, but it is the first rib. Why? Because it also contains the scalene tubercle and the grooves of subclavian vessels. And the head of the first rib contains one facet only, either in that one or in that one. It has one facet on the head, or that one facet of the head. The typical rib, the head shows two facets separated by a crest. You can see these are two facets on the typical head rib separated by a crest, while on the first rib you have only one facet on the atypical first rib. So please try to examine the first rib also at the end of the session. What is this? Maybe it is a first rib, but it is long? No, I don't think so. Why? First, because at the middle of the outer aspect of the shaft is a big tuberosity, not a tubercle. And this is a tuberosity for serratus anterior, as you can see. The first rib, for example, this one, has a small tubercle on the inner border, not a big tuberosity, separated by a groove. While here, this is a big tuberosity for serratus anterior. This is number one. Number two, the head of this rib contains two facets separated by a crest. Not one facet just like the first rib. Although we have an anterior end in the second rib, a posterior end made of head, neck, and tubercle. The second rib also contains many features of the typical rib, but the typical rib does not have tuberosity, big tuberosity for serratus anterior. This is also second rib with tuberosity for serratus anterior. This is a typical rib. I will add it to the series of the typical rib, although it is short. This is a second rib. I will add it to the series of the second, and you have to discriminate them. This is also a typical. That is a rib which is probably typical. But the problem with that rib is that the head shows only one facet, so it is not typical. It is the 10th rib, right? These ribs, for example, this one, have head with one facet. I cannot see a neck and a tubercle. I cannot see an angle. The anterior end is pointed. This is either the 11th or 12th rib, because the typical rib must show a concave anterior end. This is a pointed anterior end. It has a costal groove, but it is 11th or 12th rib. The head is one facet. There is no head, neck, tubercle. That one also has a pointed anterior end, one facet on the head, no tubercle and neck, as you can see. Has costal groove. This is either the 11 or 12 rib. So you can see that in the practical session, the knowledge is different from the theory. Here, you have to learn the skills to identify the ribs. While in the lecture, you have to have the knowledge of the criteria of the ribs. The information theoretically explained in the lecture must be here transformed into skills of how knowing which is typical and which is atypical, and what are the typical the features of the typical ribs and what are the typical of the atypical. This is a skill that must be known during practical session. You could not learn such skills on the theory. You must have a practical session. Regarding the sternum, this is a sternum. It is made of a quadrangular manubrium. Below it is a body, and the xiphoid process is fractured here, is damaged. This is the manubriosternal angle, which is called manubriosternal joint. You can see that the manubrium has an upper border which is formed by the jugular notch. On the side of it, this is a facet for articulation of the clavicle. More laterally, this is a facet for articulation of the first costal cartilage. This is for the clavicle, while that is for the first costal cartilage. The facet on the second costal cartilage would be at the mandibulosternal joint. And this is a facet for the third, fourth, fifth, sixth, and seventh. Right? You can see that the body of the sternum shows transverse ridges that indicates that this body of the sternum, originally in embryo, is made of many small pieces of cartilage that ossify later on. And these species of cartilage that ossifies after fetal period are called sternibri. So you can see many ridges here. But you can see that the sternal angle, the mandibulosternal joint, is very prominent as a ridge here. What is left is the vertebra. Again, the vertebrae could be classified as typical and atypical. This is typical thoracic vertebra because the spine is pointed and is directed downward. The body shows upper and lower demifacets on the body, and you have a facet for the transverse process. This is the transverse process. Of course, the facet of a transverse process articulates with the tubercle of the rib, while the facets on the body articulates with the head of the ribs. The parts of the vertebra includes body, pedicle, lamina, spine, superior articular process, and inferior articular process. All these parts should be discriminated, and this is the vertebral canal. If you examine the morphology of this typical thoracic vertebra, you can easily discriminate that this is not a typical thoracic vertebra, right? And also that one. Although you may see a facet for the ribs, but it is not the atypical. It is atypical. And this chain here shows the thoracic vertebra in sequences. You don't need to be bothered with the features of the atypical in details in the way I have explained the features of the atypical ribs. You have only to see the features of the typical thoracic vertebra, and that's all. Next, we may look to the skeleton of the thoracic cage. Sure. لا هو ممكن انه نشيل الكاميرا شيء انا لا لا بس So you can see that this is the thoracic cage articulating. This is the manubrium of the sternum. This is the manubrio-sternal angle or joint. This is the body of manubrium. This is the xiphoid process. You can see that the ribs ends anteriorly with costal cartilages that articulates with the sternum, including the ribs from number 1 to 7. And these ribs are called true ribs or vertebral sternum. But the 8 costal cartilage, 9 and 10 are articulating with each other and articulating with the 7 costal cartilage. And therefore the costal cartilage of the 7, 8, 9, 10 ribs are forming the costal margin. You can see how the obliquity of the ribs is oriented. الفقرات. Okay. Thank you. You can see that this is the angle of the rib. These are angles of the ribs. And you can see the spines of the vertebra, the lamina. You can see the transverse process articulating with the tubercle of the rib. And here, this is the neck of the rib. This is the tubercle neck. And this is the head of the rib articulated with the body of the vertebra. We may ask you on these joints on the skeleton. I may ask you which type of this joint, the joint between the tubercle and the transverse process. You may say that this is a costovertebral joint, that is synovial joint, and that is also synovial joint. I may point here, you may say this is the neck of the typical rib, and so on. This is the spine. Okay? That's all. Please try to examine the samples after the session. Thank you. طلع احنا معتادين احنا معتادين الحالة انه من يخلص السيشن الطلاب لسبب او اخر يطلعون نوبات نقعد نتشلب بيهم نقول لهم كويز نسوي لهم بس يعني بصراحة يعني احنا نريد نفيدكم ترى احنا مو عتاب. لاحظت انه السيشن فيه هواي حكي. احنا هذا السجل ممكن ناخذ لك اياه على في اثناء ما نكتب المختبر، ممكن ناخذ لك اياه تسمعه مرة ثانية. لا تشوف نفسك مكتفي والتقارب محاضرات النظري بس تطاوع شوفن لا تطلع راسا. احنا غياب جماعة نسيسويكم بس ترى ما ممكن يعني نشوف الفيديو سكيلز لازم نشوف فيديو. اني قد صار لي من 93 هنا اول ما جيت فوعت الرد واحد شفتوني شلون قعدت شيكت هذا اول هذا ثاني غادي شوي اطاوع منه. صعب بالامتحان انت ما لازم الرد ما شايفها وتعرف هذا شنو هذا منو هذا كذا. ناقشوا بيناتكم على الموضوع هذا. شكرا.